have a conversation around Nigeria's foreign policy in the light of the president's multiple foreign trips in recent time. Adebayo Oluwake joins us, as you've seen there. He is a global affairs analyst. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
You know, foreign policy is a highly specialized, technical and very delicate, area. A number of people are aware, and it's expectedly supposed to take on some skilled superintendents by those who know. But a good number of people are also wondering, hey, there's a lot of issues to deal with here in the country. Why travel abroad? Educate us on that first, so people understand why sometimes these things are necessary.
Thank you. The fact is that your foreign policy has to be an expression of your domestic aspirations. So today, we cannot divorce foreign policy from domestic reality. And so from that standpoint, we will understand when a country pushes forward towards ensuring that those domestic aspirations are pursued by way of seeking friendly relations with states that can help actualize them. And conversely, other states are also looking at those countries that can also help them actualize their own domestic aspirations. So you cannot divorce either one. And so it's normal to find an instrument of foreign policy, in this case, either the president or the Minister of Foreign Affairs or any of those who have been appointed with that task, going out to seek relationships that can help actualize those domestic aspirations.
But doesn't that also question the ethos, the direction, the general intent of the nation? You know, there are certain countries that once you see this country, you know what their goal is. For instance, America still continues to have that slogan, America first. Well, while it can be easily said that in every country will say Nigeria first and the rest of them, but then it speaks to whether or not there is a global vision that everyone in the nation has to aspire to and work towards, and consequently the foreign policy of the country is focused in that direction as well. Do you see that? Do you see something like that in existence, something to aspire to, or something we are just not thinking about?
This is a very good question. I will first of all give an example, and then I will respond. If you remember, in the days of apartheid in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique, and so on, the Nigerian government launched what it called the Southern African Relief Fund, SARF. And the Southern African Relief Fund had a seed fund which was put in there to kickstart it by the federal military government. Then subsequently, Nigerians contributed the bulk of the money, ordinary people. I was a student at the time, and I also contributed to the Southern African Relief Fund. That fund grew to 400 million naira when one United States dollar was 63 kobo, right? And this Southern African Relief Fund enabled the Nigerian government to significantly influence the liberation struggles in Southern African states. The argument to Nigerian citizens was that we are the largest black nation on earth, and we cannot rest if other black people elsewhere are in bondage. And that gave our domestic aspiration, as it were, linked it with our foreign policy objective. This is just one example. And I think it speaks to the vision that you spoke about. Now, with the collapse of apartheid, Nigeria came up with what was called economic diplomacy. I think there was some sort of a review, and the policymakers came to the conclusion that we now needed to use our foreign policy to drive our economic aspirations. Having said that, for the past couple of years, I have not seen a shared vision that unites Nigerians behind our foreign policy objectives. And I believe that the current administration can actually review the foreign policy of Nigeria by bringing stakeholders together and asking them to sit back and look at what exactly will be in our interest. And if I just go further, if you look recently, I know President Tinubu was thrown straight away into ECOWAS challenges the meeting in Guinea-Bissau, and then a number of things followed in rapid succession. You had the Russia-Africa Summit, you had the ECOWAS Summit on Niger because of the coup in Niger, you had the BRICS meeting in South Africa, you had the G20 meeting in India, and then now you are having the G77 meeting in Havana, Cuba. But despite all of these that have been coming in torrents, I feel strongly that it will help the country if the administration could sit down and review our foreign policy. Look at what aspirations we have on the domestic front, and then bring people who have knowledge, former ambassadors, academics, just put all of these people together and let them review and make some proposals to the administration. This is because, in my view, we cannot just belong to everything. We need to begin to systematically determine what will be in our interest. We've been in the Commonwealth of Nations. Has it served our purpose? We have embassies in almost every country, because our constitution says that every state in Nigeria must have an ambassador. Now, because we have so many embassies, we always do not have enough money to finance our missions abroad. And no government has sat down to critically review this. Maybe because it might involve reviewing the constitution. Because if you have to have ambassadors everywhere, then you have so many missions that you basically don't have the money to actually finance your embassies. And those embassies are supposed to be the ones who will give expression to your foreign policy objectives. Well, so there are, for me, comprehensive things that need to be done for us to now articulate. Do we want to belong to BRICS, for instance? BRICS admitted Ethiopia with a GDP of $111 billion. Nigeria has a GDP of $140 billion. What was the criteria for admitting Ethiopia and not admitting Nigeria?
It's interesting that you're raising these issues. My sincere apologies for putting in Mr. Luwake. It's interesting that you raise these issues this way. So when you say, for instance, that we need to review our foreign policy direction, perhaps some education might be necessary, because not too long ago, both the foreign affairs minister and the president himself said, our foreign policy is now drilled down to 4 Ds of democracy, development, demography, and diaspora. So how do you see that playing in all of these issues that you have raised, particularly in the light of what you said earlier about our foreign policy needing to be directed towards economic, industrial development?
Yes, every president will have, as part of his or her manifesto, a foreign policy objective. Every president does that, But the reality is that while the president has those as a guide, we have to look at the reality on the ground, okay? We have, Nigeria has so many positives. If you look at our creative economy, for example, Nollywood, the music industry, you see let me take the music industry. When reggae music was #1 in Jamaica, reggae music contributed to the economy of Jamaica directly. You could see, first of all, in the number of tourists who went to Jamaica, and you could also see, because Jamaica has a tourist economy anyway, so reggae music further helped boost the tourism industry in Jamaica. And also, you could also see that remittances from record sales trickled back into the economy of Jamaica. Nigeria is probably the dominant country in music globally today. Does the music of Nigerian artists, does it trickle back into the economy of Nigeria? And does it impact, for example, the tourism of Nigeria? We have Nigerian musicians who go and shoot musical videos outside of Nigeria. So there are so many things. So the government needs to look at the totality of our domestic capacity and aspiration, and now feed that into whatever the foreign policy guideline or objective that the president has as part of his manifesto. But with the reality, because it's one thing when you campaign, it's another thing when you get to office and you now meet the reality on the ground. So I feel that there's still a need to have, this review. The four critical points that the president, has as his foreign policy, they are useful as a guide, okay, towards what exactly we want to aspire to. So we need to be able to use all of these elements of our aspirations domestically, to fit them into what we want to achieve internationally. Like I said. Sorry, I missed the second part of your question. If you could remind me so that I address it.
No. I mean, I think you've spoken. It's a combo of a question, just asking whether or not you think those 4 Ds that the president mentioned in his objectives line up with his intention, the general philosophy of foreign policy for domestic economic and industrial development.
Yes, now our industrial utilization in Nigeria, I really don't have the figures. At some point, it was 45%. It's probably far below that now, because when it was 45%, we still have the likes of Michelin and Dunlop operating from Nigeria. But we know quite a number of industries have either closed down or have relocated. So I wouldn't know what the industrial capacity utilization is at the moment, but I have a suspicion it's quite low. And we are talking about hiring more Nigerians, getting more young people out of unemployment. So it makes sense for us to address our industrial capacity utilization. And I think this was probably one of the objectives of the president's visit to India, and the cocktail of potential investments that have been estimated at about 14 billion, which will come into the country. But there's still a need, to develop a synergy. Yes, the president is moving in that direction, but when all of these deals are struck and people want to come into the country and they have problems maybe getting visas, or they have problems registering their businesses, it is taking them forever to have business. So there's a need to link all the critical sectors, critical agencies of government, to that foreign policy aspiration for it to have concrete expression. Otherwise, we will be having bottlenecks, in the area of those things that the administration wishes to achieve.
Speaking of synergy, Ms. Oluwake, one of the other high points of the G20 summit was the admittance of the African Union as a permanent member, I believe, into the Union. But how much of a united front and this synergy that you talk about is the African Union bringing to the table such that it can harness its own economic potential? One of the objectives of the Union is political and economic integration of the continent. So how much of unity does it present, at that table such that it can bring some gains home to the continent as well?
Thank you very much. And I have a slightly radical view on the admission of the AU, by the G20. First of all, I think that the G20 is on the back foot. The G20 has a bloodied nose as a result of its policies in Ukraine, which has had significantly negative impact on the economy of Western European nations. And so what you find happening now, in my view, is that the G20 is now reacting to what BRICS is doing, and probably having the feeling that BRICS might really expand and capture all the newly emerging economic powerhouses across the world. And so the G20 is now trying to respond to that. Now, coming back to the question of admitting the AU, if you look at the processes from when the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, was instituted, and all the processes that followed that, on the African continent, there is a tacit admission that the regional economic communities, the RECs, like Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, Southern African Development Community, SADC, East African Economic Community, Central African Customs Union, these are the legs upon which the development of Africa are now based. The regional economic communities will move. And that's why you find, for instance, that when you talk of conflict resolution, it is the regional economic communities. You're talking of ECOWAS, you talk of ECOMOG, you talk of all those instruments. It is not the AU. The AU has a mission in Somalia, the African Union mission. The AU has a hybrid mission with the United Nations in Darfur, which has wound down. But those are just minor, they are significant, but they explain that the AU is on the back foot significantly. It is the regional economic communities that are actually driving development in Africa. So if this is the scenario, I find it a bit strange that the AU is being admitted to the G20, except if it's just as an observer. Because when you compare the AU to the European Union, which is in the G20, they are completely different. The European Union is more structured, has a different orientation, and then Africa has restructured itself to rely on the regional economic communities. And you hardly hear of the AU when you're talking of challenges in Africa. There was a coup in Gabon. It was the Central African Customs Union that suspended Gabon, and that has been taking the initiative. The AU will come back to endorse what the regional economic community has done, because this is the formula we are following now.
And that's exactly... Pardon me, Mr. Oluwake, and that's exactly the point. Isn't the AU on a lower pedestal, in terms of negotiation and in terms of what's happening on the continent, when you consider the coups on the West African corridor, the political instability also in the Horn of Africa, compared with what the AU brings to the table? And that also comes with some consequence. For instance, the Trans-Morocco gas pipeline that is being built has suffered setback in terms of funding, and Dr. Chiombori Kwao, the former African Union rep, would also talk about how a lot of the companies that are building projects across the African continent corridor are not African companies, they are rather European companies. So based on all of these, isn't the African continent on a lower pedestal, even despite its admittance into the G20 table?
I agree with all the points you've raised on the capacity and challenges of the AU, but I don't think that the African continent is on a low pedestal. Africa still has most countries with the fastest growing GDPs in the world at the moment. Of course, not at the level of India and China, but still, if you look at cumulatively the countries with the fastest growing GDPs, many of them are in Africa. But what I'm saying is that, and I think I agree with you on this, it's not the AU, in my view, that should be in the G20. Because what is the AU taking to the G20? The AU is more a political assemblage of states than an economic assemblage of states. Wow. Like when you look at the European Union is decidedly economic. It has some political units and political structures, but it is decidedly economic, whereas the AU is decidedly political. And then even in its political sphere, where the AU, for instance, was supposed to have contributed to strengthening democracy on the continent, based on the foundation of the Mbeki Obasanjo leadership within the AU in the early 2000s, with the peer-reviewed mechanism. The AU is very weak. Because if you have the peer-reviewed mechanism, where you use former heads of state to influence current leaders, for example, to prevent things like wanting a third term, to improve good governance, and all those political challenges that we are going through that are resulting in coups today, you would find that the AU has decidedly become, quite weak. So I feel strongly, and I think we have a convergence of opinion on this, that rather than inviting the AU to the G20, we should be having the likes of Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa, Angola, Kenya, and Senegal, in the G20, rather than the AU.
Perhaps that's some conversation to take on shortly, but if you can do this in 30 seconds, Mr. Oluwake, do you see anything coming out of the trips of Mr. President within the shortest possible time?
I do. I just emphasize that I think the president needs to have some sort of a session, with experienced stakeholders to give strength and fillip to his foreign policy aspirations.
All right. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Adebayo Oluwake is a global affairs analyst. Thank you and all the best.